the two gospel lessons, the one that Jaden read and the one that we read. You couldn't help but notice there were some differences between the two. Details that were not the same. And this bothers some people. In our Western culture, for many centuries now, we've liked the idea of objective truth, that there is a truth that you can know for sure. And when you have a story like this, where the details tend to shift a little bit, that bothers me. So I want to talk about that a little bit. And I want to talk about that by talking about something else. That's what pastors do. On the evening of Good Friday, 1865, I remember it well. But on the evening of Good Friday, President Abraham Lincoln was attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., when a disgruntled actor named John Wilkes Booth shot him. And Charles Leal, who was an army physician who had had his medical degree for all of 6 weeks, was the very first doctor to rush to the president's seat and begin to administer care. And Charles Leal, with his six-week-old medical degree, probed the wound in Lincoln's head with his finger, which is not unusual in those days. And as he did that, he knew that the wound was mortal. He also knew that the president would not survive being transported back to the White House. So Dr. Leal saw to it that Lincoln would be moved to somewhere other than the theater to wait out the remainder of his life. And so it was that they took him across the street to the Peterson boarding house. And there, in a small bedroom, doctors tended to Lincoln while a handful of officials looked on, either sitting or standing in shifts until the president died the next day. Now, if you have seen the actual room where this happened, which I have many years ago, you know that the room itself, if you didn't know what had happened there, the room itself is nothing very remarkable. It's just a small bedroom, one of many in that house. That you can get a sense of it from this picture I'm going to show you. That's a picture of the room that was taken shortly after Lincoln's body was removed. One of the other boarders in the rooming house took it. You see, it's not very big. Thank you. Now, one cabinet official who was writing about that night, and this writing was contemporaneous with the events, recalled that when he had arrived there were perhaps 6 other people, 3 doctors and 3 other government officials who were already there on death watch. And this person who wrote named 7. And that was pretty much how it was throughout the night. Every once in a while, Mrs. Lincoln would be brought in and she would get hysterical and they would take her out. So you're talking about 6 or 7 people. And yet, less than a month after Lincoln's death, Harper's Weekly, based on published reports and first-hand accounts of people, would publish this image of the scene of Lincoln's death. Number 2, please. You can see there's quite a crowd. And a few weeks after that, another publication would publish this last image. more than 20 people. We've had church services that were smaller. So looking back at this, at the first-hand accounts of people who were there, it seems like 150 years later, we really don't know who was in that room when Lincoln died. It appears they didn't even know 2 months later who was there. And yet nobody is going to look back and claim that Lincoln didn't really die that day. The details are not always important. Look at something a little more contemporary. President John Kennedy, shot and killed in Dallas, November 22nd, 1963. And I really do remember that. Not too long afterward, a commission did an investigation and they produced a very lengthy report about what happened. It seems pretty definitive, and even so, 50 years later, on the 50-year anniversary of Kennedy's death, the New York Times could report that some 40,000 books had been written disputing the original report. 40,000 books, each with their own different story about what happened that day. So 50 years later, we could agree that he was assassinated, but that's where for some at least, that's where the agreement ended. So when you think about that, why should we be surprised that the Gospels, written, remember, decades after the event, and being viewed by us, 2,000 years later, why should we be surprised that they don't agree on the details of Easter Sunday? I'd be suspicious if they did agree. I've watched enough Law and Order episodes where I get my legal training. I've watched enough of those to know that if you have two suspects telling the exact same story, that means they're both lying. What these inconsistencies in the Gospels really tell us, and it's sort of reassuring, is that these stories are being told by human beings. People whose memories are not always great. People who have different viewpoints of what happened. People who may remember differently who was with them. But they're telling us the same extraordinary story. They're telling us about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I look at these gospel accounts, and for all of the differences between them, I see the same thing being told each time, and that is that Jesus Christ is risen. Death could not stop him, and the grave could not hold him. Jesus Christ is risen, and because of that, the possibility of salvation and the certainty of grace are set before us. So this morning, tempting as it is, I'm not going to go through the Gospels to point out the differences and to repeat what we've already heard. I won't go through the Gospels to repeat a story that is already so familiar to us and to try to arrive at some kind of objective, true account of what happened. I suspect the only way we're ever going to arrive at an objective truth is to talk to the actual witnesses themselves. And by the time we have that chance, we probably won't care anymore. Instead, I want to take just a minute or two. No, more than that. I'm never that short. I want to take just a few minutes to talk about something that I find almost as fascinating I realized this week that there is a kind of resonance between the accounts of Jesus' burial and resurrection and also the gospel accounts of his birth. Because if you remember, gospel accounts of Jesus' birth are also a little bit ambiguous. Because depending on which of the gospels you read, and there's only two that cover the birth, depending on which one you read, you see a little bit different story. And what we learn by looking at both of these events is that Jesus' life and death seem to be intertwined with a couple of Joes and a handful of Marys. And that's where the resonance comes from. In the very beginning of his life, Jesus found himself entrusted to the care and protection of a man named Joseph, a simple craftsman who was living out his faith. And at the very end of his life, Jesus also found himself, at least his body, under the care and protection of a man named Joseph. This time he was not a simple craftsman, but he was a man of some means. But this man had been touched by the words and ministry of Jesus, and he wanted to do something to care for his teacher even after he had died. So he recruited another friend, another well-to-do follower, and they took the lifeless husk of Jesus down from the cross, and they bathed him as best they could, and they wrapped him in a shroud, and they laid him to rest in the strong, cold, protective confines of a tomb carved out of rock. And if that's not enough thematic unity for you, consider that in the Gospels we're told that Jesus was laid in a manger. What's interesting about that, excuse me, is that in the first century, in that part of the world, mangers were not the wooden things that we see in our stables at Christmas time. Mangers tended to be made by taking a big rock and scooping out the interior, but you could put the hay in there for the animals. Sort of seems tomb-like in a way. So we have this echo of a manger, which morphs into a tomb, and they both hold and protect a Jesus who has no way to protect himself. If you want to get really far down the rabbit hole, think about a baby wrapped in swaddling clothes and a body wrapped in a shroud. To me, at least, it's a resonance that marks the beginning and the end of Jesus' life in a very powerful way. And it's the same with the Marys. At the beginning of his life, Jesus was carried and nurtured by a woman named Mary, of course. And during his ministry, as we learned by watching, we met him last Thursday. Jesus was ministered to and nurtured by women whose lives he had touched, and some of them were married as well. It was those women who wept for him that Friday when he was brutalized and murdered. And it was those women, some of whom were named Mary, whose devotion would lead them back to the tomb, where they would be the first to learn of his resurrection. So just to flesh that idea out, it was Mary who first learned of the life that she carried. And at the other end of his life, it was another Mary, Mary Magdalene, who first discovered that the tomb was empty and that life had been restored. Resonance, right? It seems like God's way of driving a point home so that even we can understand it. What might that point be? I thought about this a lot. Jesus began his life with a family that God chose for him. They were a good and faithful family that would devote themselves to loving and caring for him any way they could to mold him into the person that he would become. But Jesus would end his life, and he would begin a resurrection life, surrounded by a family that chose him. Surrounded by brothers and sisters who had heard the gospel and seen the miracles and listened to him talk, and who had come to love this man from Galilee who had first loved them. They were sisters and brothers who had lives that took them to many places, down many roads, but somehow all of them seemed to find their way to him. They were ordinary people who discovered that love trumps hate, life trumps death, and that there is no brokenness and no pain that Jesus cannot heal. The resurrection reminds us of that. Not just on this glorious Easter morning, but it reminds us of that every day, that Jesus Christ is risen, that death could not stop him and the grave could not hold him. Jesus Christ is risen. And because of that, the possibility of salvation and the certainty of grace are set before us. And when we believe that, we are all members of his family. Mary, Joseph, Kim, Ken, Connie, all of us. We're part of that family. All of us are united in Christ. So I encourage you today to go forth from here. Share that good news. Anyone you know who is struggling. With anyone you know who is weary of this world and who is seeking love but cannot find it. They need look no further than Jesus.